All right. So we are pleased tonight to have George Homsy, who will discuss the history, negative effects, and what we can do about the chaos of suburban sprawl. It affects our immediate area, our own communities right here in the Broome County area, and other communities across New York State and the nation and even the world. So George directs the Environmental Studies program at Binghamton University. His research focuses on sustainability and local government policymaking. Currently, he is looking at sustainability leadership, in local governments and energy policies impacting low to moderate income households. George received his PhD from Cornell University in city and regional planning. Before that, he was a planning consultant working with communities in upstate New York. George began his investigation of local governments and sustainability as a journalist with a public radio environmental news magazine called Living on Earth, which he co-founded and co-produced, and that program is still running on public broadcasting. So we're thankful that George did that and that he's still working hard, helping students learn about environmental studies, environmental science. He previously gave us a presentation on how to make cities more walkable. Welcome back, George, and please go ahead with telling us about the chaos of sprawl.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation back. I enjoyed talking with you all last time and liked the in-person, but I appreciate that we were able to do this technologically today. I'll just dig right into it. My first bunch of slides tends to be about myself, but you just heard that I was an environmental journalist and urban planner. And then I got my PhD late in life and applied. I was based in Saratoga Springs. I got my PhD at Cornell, and then I applied to jobs all over the country and ended up at Binghamton, just down the road at Binghamton University, which I have been thankful for. It's been a great place, and the community's been great to work in and work with. So I have 4 topics basically that I want to talk about. And as I go through these, I really want people, it is okay to interrupt. Raise your hand, put something in the chat. I can, as students will tell you, I can just go and go. And sometimes that's, I'd like to hear, questions, especially because sprawl is such a complicated topic. There are many aspects of it. I picked a few to talk about that I think are interesting and relevant to what we're doing in Broome County. But, please interrupt and talk and ask me questions as much as you can. So the other thing to think about is how sprawl is this downward spiral. And, how we have to find ways that we can, I'm going to try and use that, and refer back to that downward spiral in, throughout the conversation. But that's one of the things that I think is something to talk about. While I consider it a downward spiral, there are also real reasons why people live where they live. And we can't just dismiss those. We have to talk about why those kinds of things ended up, why people have sprawled out through Vestal or through other towns around Binghamton, as opposed to filling in Binghamton. And there are real important reasons why that happened. And that's, what causes the downward sprawl. I'm on
George, sorry to interrupt.
Nope, I just saw that.
Oh, that's better. You caught on. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Someone put it in. Thank you, Gay. I was supposed to ask that first to make sure I had the right one said. Okay, so those are the 4 topics that we do. I talked about the downward spiral. So the first question I really want to bring up is, why do people live in suburbs? Okay. And so I would like to actually ask that of people. Why do you think people live in suburbs? Why is it that you might live in a suburb? I don't know where everyone lives, But what is it about the suburbs that people like? Can you raise your hands or throw stuff in the chat?
Green
It's much
space.
harder to use with the phone than with.
Green, I'm just green space.
Green space, yep, good one. And I heard someone say something about being much harder to, but I didn't hear the object. Don't have close neighbors, so that's, you like that, Victor.
There's gardening.
Gardening, good. Valdi?
Yeah, I sorry to admit it, but we picked the suburban location too, because we like the yard. We like to have, we liked having room for our children to play on our own yard. And now we, you know, we do a lot of gardening, and we've done landscaping and the privacy aspect too. But I know the negatives. The negatives are real, and that it's, you sort of end up being disconnected from people. If people don't come out of their house, you don't meet people. You know, it's not all that walkable. We don't really have a sidewalk that extends into our neighborhood, so it's those are the kind of downsides. And when you want to go shopping, yeah, we can walk 1 mile to get to a grocery store and a drugstore. But if we were, you know, in a downtown area, those things would probably be much closer, and we'd have maybe more community engagement with our neighbors.
So I see a lot of similar things in the chat going through too. Believing the schools are better, close to services, or, you know, or not, as you just said, privacy and peaceful, quality of life. I presume a negative is the racism and classism that Ruth types in. Privacy, peaceful backyards. So those are all real positive. I mean, those are all real reasons why people live, in addition to some of the downsides, but why people live in suburbs. And we need to think, as we talk about the negatives, whether they're worth it, and how can we get some of those values into other places and into more walkable places, or create more walkable places in our suburbs. And I'd like to touch on both of those. There was a survey that the Pew Center did, which shows that the you know, a majority of people like the suburbs. The EPA did a survey 10 to 15 years ago that showed people do want more walkability, do want some of the assets of city living. And the challenge was there was no option to it. And I think a lot of people, well, you know, we imagine the city as New York City. I think a lot of people in the suburbs, probably more than they think, would like to live in a city if it had, you know, if they could depend on the schools, if they could depend on the safety and things like that. Anecdotally, my brother lived, you know, he was in the Army, moved around buying houses in sprawling places. His favorite place is a walkable community just outside of Detroit, where he has the neighbors, he has the sidewalk, but he has a backyard. He doesn't see green space. I mean, it's not like he looks out into a forest or anything. But I think there, you know, there needs to be more options for people. But by and large, people do like the suburbs. And then the University of Toronto found these things that were important to people who lived in the suburbs. Recognized that the suburbs in Toronto and in Canadian cities in general are different than, you know, we're experiencing in Broome County, especially in terms of public transit. But the safety was a big one. And then other studies show, and people today, you know, mentioned, they get to have bigger homes. They get to have lower cost homes in most places. It's cheaper to live further out than it is to live in a city. That's not the case here in Binghamton, but that's often the case. People mention space. That's one of the things. People mention better schools, and that is often a big driver. And we'll talk about why that might be the case as we go through things. And again, think about how these things all come together in terms of this downward spiral. How can we change what we're doing to make cities, or at least to densify the suburbs enough that people can have the things they want without the negative impacts? So this is a weird question. Can anyone tell me what they think sprawl is?
Good question. Question.
It is, anyone want to venture a guess? Unrestricted expansion, good. Density where it isn't intended. And I would challenge to say what kind of density and how dense, but that's also a good point. And also I would challenge intended, because I think from different perspectives, you know, density is intended in some places. It's not always for societal or environmental good. Any other want to jump in, Valdi? Yep, want to give something quickly? Yep.
Yes, I would say poorly planned expansion that is more driven by developers being able to buy properties, you know, big tracts of land, maybe from a farmer, and just chunking it up and then applying, you know, getting it approved by the local municipal or town officials, and just going ahead and then you know, extending whatever needs to be extended in terms of utilities, and whether or not it's in a practical location or provides access to things that are convenient is not really a consideration in a lot of cases.
And I think that's the case. And Aaron mentions that as well, unplanned developments. And I think that's often what it is. Cities tend to be not, I want to say, well, they tend to be planned. We can argue whether they're well planned or not, but they tend to be planned. Suburbs tend to be more market driven. And so we get this sort of unorganized pattern in terms of and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. These are some of the things that, I've covered up the, you can't read the citation, but this is some of the things that people really identify. And where Ruth mentions nothing in walking distance, it is that auto dependency that really is a hallmark of sprawl and the suburbs. The outward growth, people talked about that, the leapfrogging pattern, the strip development. Was there someone trying to say something else? No, okay. And this undefined edge between urban and rural. And as you drive in Canada, that edge is really sort of striking. They do have suburbs up there, but you know, it's very quickly you can go from rural areas to suburban areas. So this is sort of what it looks like. When I was a planner in my second career, this is one of the places that we did some planning work, trying to get the sprawl under control in Victor, New York. Here's another town, Queensbury, New York. Come on, change, please. Which had this sprawl. Another hallmark of it is the lack of a distinction, I think. I mean, these stores, these signs, these roadways, they could be anywhere in the United States. I think that's one of the important things. And then here's from a European photo. This is a typical rural urban edge where you have density, still single family homes, but walkable density right up against farmland. Interestingly, and a lot of people talk about it from a density perspective, but it's not just about density. One of the densest places in the world is also one of the most sprawling, and that's Las Vegas, Nevada. They have a lot of single family homes. It's not very walkable because it's too far to get some places. But if you really zoom in, you can see that these are, they're big homes too, but it's very, very dense. So when we're talking about what is sprawl, there's two kinds of sprawl that we talk about. There's sprawl with growth. And here you can see the Los Angeles city in the yellow line and the metropolitan statistical area, essentially the area around it, in the white line. And you can see that, and we'll see this pattern a couple of times. Well, you see it over and over again as you look at places around the country. At one point, the urban core was a large chunk of the population. This is I should have said a chart of the number of people over time. And now that's been dramatically reduced. In Los Angeles, though, the whole region is growing. Here's Las Vegas, Nevada. I just showed a picture. And you can see now, similarly, that Las Vegas is, about a third of the whole metropolitan area population. This is just a cool graphic looking at the patterns in Las Vegas over time. You know, how they started from nothing in the early 20th century and how they grew and grew and grew. And there's issues there of, it's a fascinating place to go to. I'm sure a number of you have been there. But there's, I don't go very often, but it's just so interesting to see how they could build such places in a desert, worrying about water, having all this sun beating down on them. And you don't see, or at least the last time I was there, like 15 years ago, you don't see solar panels anywhere. It's just craziness. And this is another one, Portland, Oregon, the same way. It's a growing region, but the urban center, while growing, is you know, still a small part of the entire region. This is a pattern we're more familiar with. Here's Flint, Michigan, where it's the urban core is smaller than in the growing areas, but the whole region is no longer growing. And this is something we're very familiar with in upstate New York. This is Detroit, Michigan. You can see that the core city is 17% of the metropolitan region. This is Syracuse. It's only a fifth of the entire region. And here's Binghamton. And here you can see that we're not, 19% of the metropolitan statistical area, which in our case includes just Broome and Tioga counties, is in the core city of Binghamton, the principal city of the MSA. But you can also see that the region is no longer growing. And at one point, at its height in 1920, its height in terms of being the most important part of the region, Binghamton was almost 60%, had 60% of the people. In the 1950s, it peaked at population, which of course I can't remember now, somewhere around 75,000, I think. People might not remember that, but might remember the number. But then there was the decline of Binghamton, the yellow line, while the suburbs started to grow and grow. And now, that growth is leveled off. So these images and these numbers sort of illustrate that sprawl, that going out from the urban core. Now we get into what are the impacts. All right. And I'm going to talk about a bunch of them. And some of which you'll be very familiar with, some of which I touched on in the last talk, and I hope that we can learn something. This is a common one, and I think one of the ones we're probably most worried about now is this idea of increased vehicle miles traveled. Okay, when you have suburban sprawl, in our area especially, we have more miles to go, more cars to drive, and most of our cars still emit carbon dioxide emissions. That's not a shock. It's very straightforward. This is just a chart of as you move out in terms of increased density, moving along the x-axis in an urban area, you can see that the vehicle miles traveled per capita goes down. Not a shock. You have more spaces to go. And sadly, in many places, we don't have the, public transit to make up for that. This is over time, you can see, especially after World War II, the growth in our public road mileage in the orange line here, and then the skyrocketing growth of the actual miles that we traveled in the blue line. And so you can, and part of that is the growth in population. I mean, this is not all due to sprawl, but part of it is because this population has lived in places with fewer options for public transit and also with fewer, with more space in between where people want to go. And of course, we know that of the greenhouse gas emissions emitted in the United States, more than a quarter of them come from the transportation sector, which is why this is an important issue. The other thing that happens, though not really in our area, is increased congestion increases CO2. We don't have this kind of traffic. This is outside Los Angeles when I was taking a a van from the airport to my hotel a few years ago, and it was like, oh my God, I have to take a picture. This is exactly what people talk about in terms of traffic. How great. I can show this to everybody now. That joy lasted like a minute, and then I still had to sit there 45 minutes going a very short distance. But you know, this increases CO2 dramatically as well. And this is a result of sprawl and the lack of good public transportation. As we talk about transit, I also want to just let you know that there is a tool that, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but the Binghamton Metropolitan Transportation Study, our regional MPO, has a traffic tool online that you can use. And it looks at speeds, volume of traffic, accidents at different places around the county. And so as you are talking about a development or trying to figure out a problem with traffic, you can go and see data, and they're actually excellent people too. I'm sure some of you know them already, and I'm sure they'd be helpful in terms of providing information and helping understand what's going on in a particular place. But we did a tour with them, and I work a lot in the North of Main neighborhood in Binghamton, and we did a tour with them of intersections where we wanted changes to be made, and they in some cases agreed, in some cases didn't. And so, you know, put in to have money available to start making changes in some of these bad intersections. So as you're thinking about traffic around Broome County, I would lean on them. So we talked about those impacts. There's habitat fragmentation, okay, which is another big impact, not a shocker. As we put roads through things, as we put up developments, we reduce the amount of habitat available, and we change the amount, the way habitat is. You know, there are certain species that like it denser, that like it, you know, to be in more forested lands. There are some that would prefer the edge along, you know, farms or along roads and things like that. And so we're altering that kind of habitat and fracturing it. So it's harder for species to move from one place to the other safely. Oh, I don't think I put in, oh, I meant to, I'm sorry. They have there's this great bridge in Texas, this wildlife bridge, and they're increasing in different places where, you know, they build a bridge over a highway so that wildlife anyway can cross back and forth. And I'm always like, how well can that work? How can they find it? And I'm not a wildlife biologist, so I don't know how they do it, but apparently they claim that they do. And so that's an interesting adaptation that we've had to make for our sprawling style in order to get, you know, to protect at least a piece of nature. And, you know, that's kind of the thing we have to think about. Here we are doing something destructive and then paying even more money to sort of fix that destruction. And so that's part of that downward spiral that we need to think about. These are just examples of different, fragmentation patterns. Farms, though they look green, as you all know, and they do, you know, they are okay for some kinds of wildlife, certainly not for any other plant species besides what the farmer's growing. But it's, you know, you can see how they would also fragment a place and make it harder for other species to pass. Yeah, how do they know though, Victor? I mean, that's always the question. And I don't know if that's something that you happen to know. Do they just find it? And so they, you know, it's like training my dog and those that survive. I mean, that's what's really interesting. But I have seen, yes, I meant to show pictures. I have some slides of this really cool one in Texas. And so you can just see how we encroach on things and break up the habitat. And even in smaller ways, you know, we're putting bridges and barriers between, and we're increasing conflicts. You know, there'll be more accidents with cars, the more roads there are in these areas. There'll be more, you know, creatures of some sort or another coming into, you know, people's backyards looking for food and changing the way they, you know, their patterns of feeding and living. Higher heat is also an issue, a problem with sprawl. So many of you probably have seen this diagram of the urban heat island effect, and you can see the peak in the middle where the, urban areas by their nature are hotter. Well, the same thing happens to admittedly lesser extent in suburban areas. So here you can see that there's, where a natural area might be 85 degrees, a suburban area might be, I'd have to count now, 86, 87, 88, 88 to 89 degrees. The urban area will be a few degrees hotter. So we have that urban, I guess we can call it a suburban heat island effect happening. And that occurs because of the loss of vegetation, which both shades areas and by its respiration, plant respiration takes heat out of the air. The use of heat absorbing materials in the buildings and in the roads. This dense urban design, this part of the things I use these slides to, and we do measurements of the urban heat island effect in my large 230 person class. But dense urban design is probably less relevant in a suburban area, but certainly waste heat from cars and buildings, air conditioners, anything that's producing heat can cause that suburban effect. Then, of course, there's the stormwater management and the risk of flooding. And this also shouldn't be too much of a shocker. You can see that in a natural area, a lot of the water, that rain that goes through the, a chunk of it will evaporate. Some of it will run off. But a lot of it in this diagram, in this particular place, 50% say, will infiltrate into the ground, become part of the groundwater. When we change the environment and pave things, that equation changes. And this is, you can see here, how much now runs off into the waterways. And that can contribute to downstream flooding because now the water is not being absorbed into the ground nearly as much, and also therefore not recharging aquifers or recharging groundwater. But it is, running into it's just running directly into the waterway, and that will cause a lot of downstream flooding. And, this diagram, this drawing is of an urban area, but of course, our suburban areas are covered in pavement. And this is something I'm going to talk about, rethinking how we do our parking a little bit later. But this is one of the huge issues. And here's a chart that I use, over time. This is in a big storm event. Naturally, there's going to be some runoff, but it's going to gradually increase because a lot of it is absorbed and there's time for, some of it is caught by vegetation and allowed to evaporate, and then it gradually recedes. Whereas in a more developed area, it just rises sharply because that water is pouring into the river through, like, running off directly or running off through our stormwater systems. And then it also decreases really rapidly as well. So that's the idea of, the problem with sprawl is that we have more and more parking lots like this. And then it leads to, and I'm sure you've all seen these dramatic pictures of what's happened in Binghamton. I'm not saying upstream. I don't know the way the geology has changed upstream in terms of, the pavement and how much that would have contributed to our floods. But this is something that we consistently worry about. With that stormwater management, of course, you probably also understand that we have increased water pollution, because that water, as it's running off, through that huge parking lot or from the homes, will pick up oils. There's sometimes pollution from septic systems. Big problem is lawn and farm fertilizers, pet waste, all sorts of things that can end up in the, directly in the river. And this is it's a big problem in the cities, and in Binghamton, I still think in many places we have storm sewers that don't go through the treatment plant because we want to protect the treatment plant from overflowing and then causing pollution in rainstorms. But at the same time, we now have untreated water, untreated runoff water now going into the rivers. So which is better? Again, this is, do we build a big enough treatment plant to handle this, which is very expensive correction for this, the sprawling, or do we let it run off into the system whenever it rains into the rivers and things like that? And that kind of pollution, causes algae blooms, particularly. That's a lot of nutrients, especially from the fertilizers, from lawn chemicals and things like that. And then, as someone mentioned, there is the racial and economic segregation that occurs. And this in and of itself is a real complicated topic and fascinating. I've just first to illustrate what has happened. This is where the lighter colors here are where, so this is a measure of how people on the census say, the percentage of people who say they are just white. And the darker the color, they're a higher percentage of people. This is by census tract. And so you can see, surrounding Binghamton, it's above 70, above 3/4 white alone. And then it gradually, as you go into the downtown core, you can see that it's, it gets more and more, there's more, mostly African-Americans, some Latino, but you can see that that concentration happens. And here, similarly, we have a concentration of poverty by the same token. Here you can see, oops, the darker colors are the higher census tracts with the median household income is where the median household income is higher. And you can see that, in downtown Binghamton, we have the lighter colors, which are the poorer areas. And this is a common thing. I did those maps of our area. This is Syracuse, New York. You can see the same pattern happening. And I didn't bring Detroit. I have I've done maps for Detroit to show that, to illustrate the same thing. You can see that the sprawl, as people move out, they leave some people behind. And this again becomes part of the downward spiral as we erode the tax base. Okay. And as we think about why people leave. Andy, starting to allow auxiliary, what? You mean dwelling units? Dwelling units, yes. Okay. So that's a different issue around, it's not a different issue. It's a way of creating more affordable housing in places. And you can do it in cities, you can do it in suburbs. It's this auxiliary dwelling unit is this idea of a, converting your garage to an apartment, a smaller place that is affordable. They sometimes called granny flats because the grandmother of the family used to be able to live there, but in a separate unit. And more places are doing that because it increases density and allows people to live in certain places. But it often doesn't change the building pattern because it's like an existing basement where a unit goes in or above an existing garage. And so while related, and I think important in terms of affordable housing, even in suburban areas, it's still, I still think we have the, we're going to see this racial and economic segregation because and this is a whole different discussion, which I'm happy to engage at any time, but I'm not of the mind that the more units you have necessarily brings down prices, which a lot of economists tend to think in a community. I don't think you can often put enough houses in to bring down prices. Now, of course, in Binghamton, we have so many units that our houses have practically no value. That's a little overstating it, of course. But if you have a booming place, it's hard to, like New York City, it's hard to build enough units to really bring it down. This is trying to do that. Where it does help with affordable housing is their smaller units, and so they'd necessarily be more affordable. Sorry, am I talking over somebody? Nope. Okay. So getting back to the racial and economic segregation. So I showed, what that is, and why that happens is and it's related to this erosion of tax base. And this is sort of that downward spiral. What happens in our cities is we have lots of abandoned properties. This is one in Binghamton. I have these pictures from Detroit. My brother lives, as I mentioned, just outside Detroit. So I'm always going in Detroit taking pictures. And these are places where, where you can imagine this used to be full of houses with people taking services, but also paying taxes. And now it's all gone. But you can also imagine that the pipe has to go from, say I was standing next to a house, still has to run the whole and be taken care of the whole length of this street. So we still have, these costs, but we've lost all of this tax base. Okay. And so we can actually see that in our area. Investal has a population of only 28,000 people compared to Binghamton's 45,000. And the median household income is much higher, about twice that. So the other relevant thing to this is looking at the value of properties in the two communities. So in the old, denser urban center, we've lost so much value that now our twice the population living here, we have less value than in Vestal. This is the full valuation. This comes from the New York State Comptroller's office, these numbers. And so this is what's called the tax base. This is what you can raise money on as a community. And you have a lot more money per person to raise money on and per property to raise money on than you have in Binghamton. So in Binghamton, we still have to, as I mentioned, take care of water and sewer infrastructure, police and fire, and schools. And what happens is a lot of people who are left behind. Well, first of all, the water and sewer infrastructure is older, and so then it would be in Vestal. So it needs more servicing. The police and fire departments, the buildings, the people who have been left behind, the poorer people, they tend to need more services. They tend to need, and Binghamton does provide in its schools a lot more services. So, for example, these are much more expensive than they are in Vestal. And so we have less tax base to build upon, to call upon. And so whereas, and I don't know if this is still the case, but whereas I looked this up, this was a while ago, from the comptroller, this was the tax rate that, anyway, this is the New York State tax rate. They have to calculate things because everyone evaluates their properties differently. But this is what was in Vestal, and this is what was in Binghamton. And so you can see how this spiral then happens, because what you end up with, this downward spiral, is you have higher taxes, you have perceived poor schools, probably poorer services because you have less money to draw on. So then more people leave. And so then this goes up, this goes down, this tax rate goes up, and then more people leave. And who gets left behind? The people who need more and more services. And so this is sort of the downward spiral of sprawling suburbs. Okay. And so, is that clear enough? I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward, but I think people don't understand this real race to get tax base and development really hurts places. And so the next slide is what causes sprawl. Well, what we just talked about, this downward spiral causes sprawl, and I think is one of the big drivers today. I'll go through these slides. Originally, it was similar to what we see today. It was congestion, pollution, poverty, and fear of the other. Not wanting to be near the African-American neighborhoods or the Italian neighborhoods or whatever it was that at the time people considered the other. And so these are just, you know, dirty pictures of mostly New York City. And we see that in Binghamton too. This is what we often hear about. This is what the newspapers and the TVs report on. Okay. And I'm still surprised at how many people say, oh, I never go to downtown Binghamton, or I'm afraid of downtown Binghamton. Now, I'm not going to say it. I talk to a lot of people who say this, but I hear this more than I ever would have thought, especially in a smaller town here. And so I think this is this holdover of urban is bad, suburban is good. And I think this contributes to the spiral because there are more problems in Binghamton than in, you know, Vestal, for example. But they, you know, crime is a very, you know, as a tangent, while there is more crime, it is almost always between people who have some sort of a relationship. It could be a domestic relationship, it could be a drug or, you know, some sort of nefarious relationship. Yes.
This is Chris Rounds. It just occurs to me that one of the things we're looking at here is that people who move to the suburbs have a choice. And one of the things they're choosing is to move away from diversity. And
Yes.
particularly moving away from poor people, whatever their culture.
Yep. I mean, that was white flight. That was the essence of what happened in all of our cities, most of our cities, when people fled. You are completely right, Chris. That it's a, you know, a good succinct way of putting it is people want to get away from these things. You see it in Detroit all the time. You still see, I mean, the downtown is now booming, but, you know, still so many people are afraid to drive around certain parts of it. And the reality is, and I wish I should have looked for this study, you are more likely to die in a rural region from a car accident or an exurban region, a suburban rural area, in a car accident than you are in a crime in a city. Because everyone's driving, but most people aren't. Like, you know, you walk through a bad neighborhood, but unless you're doing something, no one, you know, I don't want to say no one's going to bother you because of course it does happen. But I mean, there's usually a relationship. Most of the crimes you read about are someone was upset with someone else.
I think
know?
another dimension of this is people raising families and the fear of the other, but also searching for quote unquote better schools.
Yes.
So we move to the suburbs to get safer places, better schools, and away from them.
Yes, I think you're completely correct. And in some cases, you will have better schools in the suburbs. And so why do we have that? Well, because we have this unequal distribution of where people who need goods, you know, who need more services lives and where the money can be. So there is some truth to that, but that perpetuates that downward spiral. There's also, you know, some problems with it in that, you know, I don't know for sure in Vestal, but I've heard that if you have a special needs student in Vestal, they often end up going to Binghamton because Binghamton has the special needs programs. I don't know if that's the case. I've heard that. But, you know, in other places that I've been, I've heard that, you know, there's more languages in the city that you can take because the state gives them more money than they would give to a richer school district. So it is real in some ways, and it is imagined in other ways too. And the real part, we really have to think about how do we balance that out? And quite frankly, the imagined part, because kids in Vestal should have access to as many languages as taught as kids in Binghamton, if that's indeed the case. It's just that, you know, so we need to think about ways to better balance money. And it's very, very difficult to do that. Valdi and then Ruth.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and in many ways, I hear people, because I live in a suburb, complaining about people supposedly not pulling their fair share in terms of contributing to society, in terms of not getting jobs that are adequate, to get decent homes and to get decent school districts. And these people are living in the suburb here where the school actually is good, and they're complaining about this. And really, the schools that are having trouble funding is what you're pointing to in the hollowed out urban cores, where the tax base has been decreasing, and it just seems eminently unfair to me that our schools are predominantly funded by this weird model. I don't know if it's just the United States, or the United States happens to be one of the countries that does this in such a big way. It's based on property tax, which it's short-sighted because you don't know where the next Madame Curie is going to be. They could possibly be in a underfunded school district in an urban hollowed out core, or maybe the next Einstein, or the next Madame Teresa, or whoever you value as a hero. We don't know where that child might grow up, and it's eminently unfair that you deprive them of resources just because their parents don't have the ability. Maybe they didn't get a good education themselves and are struggling, and that's the only thing they can afford. So it just seems eminently unfair, and this has been brought up decades ago. I forgot the person that brought this up, but they had a TV show where they talked about this, and maybe you can recall who that was. But
I can say that both New Hampshire and New York have recognized this unfairness, the courts have, and have pushed the states to distribute money more fairly, and it doesn't work. And I don't, they aren't doing a very good job of it. Ruth?
Just want to say in defense of Binghamton schools, my grandson is now a junior in high school and has had an excellent experience in the Binghamton schools, particularly in the high school. He's taking college courses in the high school, including one that's taught by a professor. The arts and the music programs in the high school at Binghamton far surpass any other school in the county. And plus you get an education by going to school with people that don't look like you, and you won't get that at Maine Endwell or Vestal. There's people think that students at Binghamton High School behave badly. I don't hear about any of that. I just don't hear about it. It's fine. So, it's a lot of the stuff you get on TV that's a lot of racist, whatever.
Yep. No, I think you're completely right, because I think that I do think that there are more challenges in an urban school district with the population that got left behind. But by the same token, it does have a very rich curriculum. Most of the time, it's fine. But of course, we hear about the bad times. That's what makes the news. And it is very sad that people don't get more, don't see what Ruth, your family has seen, the good side of it. I will say there was a professor who lived in a suburban area because they were worried about schools, and they told me they regretted it because they really wanted more diversity, and to expose their kids to more diversity, and they didn't get it in, I can't remember where it was. She didn't live in Vestal, but anyway. Homelessness, Andy, is going to be a problem. We tackle it differently here than in California. I just heard a great podcast about this. It's not my area of expertise, but there's a UCLA, they put their professors on, and they had one who talked about a survey of homelessness. And that's a whole fascinating topic that I'd be happy to dig that link out after the meeting and send it if people are interested. So what causes sprawl? There's all sorts of things, and I'm only going to touch on a few so that we can get to some of the cures of sprawl. But it is transportation. This is the list. It's not a shock. Transportation infrastructure. This is we hear this all the time. This is an example I use from class. This is a photo from 1985. Most importantly, you can see there's no road there. You see a road go in by 1995, and you start to see development all around it start to grow up. And then as part of that road, this is another, the town we were just looking at is inside the red. This is another part. And you can see the road really accelerating here outside of that, the area which it was. And so this is where pipes go, where infrastructure goes. You know, this is a city policy that, you know, could promote sprawl. This is also from a great This American Life episode. It's years old now. I have students still listen to it, called Can You Fight City Hall If You Are City Hall? And it's all about people in a community fighting a development and having to fight the people in charge of the government and having different factions and having developers. In this case, the developers was the, I don't think it was Ross Perot, but I think it was his family or his company who were the developers. And it's, I mean, it'll resonate with people in Vestal now after what happened with the previous election and trying to fight the development that was going to go up on the hill. But anyway, I highly advise listening to that. It's a great This American Life. Major civic projects, putting projects, civic projects and economic projects away from the cities. We talked about the tax rate differences. And a lot of this is driven by this drive for development. You saw how much valuation there is in Vestal. And that's because that's, you know, we've in Vestal wanted people to, I mean, the people of Vestal want that tax base there because it keeps their taxes lower. And here you can see, you know, all of these projects, those are commercial ones. And here's a big civic one, which granted was, well, all of these are probably decades and decades old now, but these were all done outside of the city. And I don't think people necessarily recognize what would happen when they put Binghamton University where they did, but that was, you know, and is a major driver of the sprawl because of what's going on down there. And I think that when the university put the downtown center in downtown, it helped, you know, people understand we could do things in downtown Binghamton. I wasn't here at the time, so I can't see the transition of what people said and thought, but I think that that's, you know, then some housing developments, student housing developments went up, and I think that enlivened downtown. Well, that's, you know, when you put these things places, people will follow. And again, this fragmentation of government is really part of this problem because, you know, we are competing against each other for this tax base. And so, yeah, maybe Walmart can't fit in Binghamton, although it probably could in some areas. We do have that. But they're going to go where, you know, they can get the best deal or where the land is cheapest, either cheapest to buy or cheapest to build on, because a lot of land in Binghamton is probably contaminated. So, you know, but pushing that outside cuts the ability of downtown to have viable businesses, thereby lowering its, you know, tax base as those buildings that house those businesses lose value, and increases the tax base in Vestal with this sprawl. These last four, I'm not going to talk about because we just don't have time, but, you know, farmers wanting to sell their land because of market pressures or because they have no one to buy the land because the next generation of farmers don't want it. That's a big cause of sprawl. In the Victor example I gave at the very beginning, you know, there was a town that had a lot of suburbs and still had a lot of farms at the time. And this was a big thing they heard is this was their retirement. They wanted to sell that land because they to developers so that, you know, when they were done farming, they'd have something to live on. Old housing stock in cities, contamination. These are big reasons that people leave. And these are good reasons to not, you know, that these are things that need to be corrected. I'm not saying they're good reasons, but if things are contaminated or not suitable, you understand why people leave. It's the same thing with buildings. The old footprints of buildings don't match modern retail. So how do we fix that? Also, it was hard to rehab older buildings until the early 21st century because of the building code. You know, it was way too expensive to do it. They didn't recognize some of the historic features. And so these buildings sat and sat and sat. And then there's exclusionary zoning, large lot zoning that keeps poor people out of the suburbs. Okay, well, we can't get into all those things. They're all fascinating and we could be here forever. What did cities do in response? I just find this very funny. They tried to look more like the suburbs. This was from, oh, I wish I had the date on this. This is a plan of an urban renewal plan for downtown Binghamton. And you can see that, you know, now we started to say, hey, we want squat buildings. We don't care. We really want to cater to cars. This is, well, this is where it was. Now you recognize it. This was the plan, and this is what came out. Of course, the plan didn't have a baseball stadium, but you can see huge buildings. They took down the dense buildings, and they put in huge parking lots. I mean, I kind of like having the baseball stadium in downtown. I think that was, or near downtown. I think that's kind of a good idea. But do we need this, big facility downtown? And, we have these high rises and things like that. And this is, the loop we have to move cars. We need to become more auto-centric. And changing this is changing to think, and this is what Syracuse is doing as they take down I-81. They're part of it is because they have to take down I-81, and part of it is because they have to do something with it because it's falling apart. But part of it is because they want to try and reknit the urban fabric. There is no urban fabric here. It looks more like a suburb moving cars around. And this is my favorite example. This is actually downtown. This is Court Street. And this was the vision for it, which is take down all those buildings and put in new big buildings. Here's the parking lot. Here's what is the Metro Center. Here's the other parking lot. And you can see it right here, the Metro Center, the parking lot. This is another angle of it. This is where the Metro Center was going to be. Here's the parking lot, which is now torn down. And there was a connection to here, a connection to here, so people didn't have to walk on the street. I don't know what this was supposed to be, but you can see this is a very, low and unurban place. They kept a few iconic buildings, but otherwise they wanted to just, basically rework what happened to downtown. And then you can see what it is. Here's the parking lot that's now gone. Here's the other parking lot. There used to be these connectors to what they thought was this mall. Of course, this fails because you can't outcompete the suburbs in terms of this kind of development. And luckily they didn't tear down any more, and they kept, what the downtown street front might be. So what can we do about it? How much time do we have left? 21 minutes. All right. Please continue to interrupt. One big thing, which is really hard to do, is change the relationship between municipalities, because we are in this competitive, drive for development, for tax dollars. So how do we do it? The previous governor had wanted to do consolidation of communities, offered a lot of money to do this, but it doesn't work. Okay. But I mean, he wanted to do it because he saw efficiencies, which may or may not, studies are mixed on whether those actually appear. I think they will, but over time. But people are loath to give up their local identity. And then, their schools, their school mascots. I mean, these are important things to a community. And so consolidation doesn't always work that well for weird reasons. I mean, I think it's good if you can start to share tax base. Cooperation more commonly between places. Sorry? We see this a
Just
lot.
background noise.
Okay, yep. We see this a lot in some services, DPWs, fire departments, they cooperate between communities. But in other places, we actually have cooperative planning. We have metropolitan governance structures, and those tend to make things a little bit more rational. A radical plan, which has happened in a few areas, but the most famous example is in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, or in that region where they do tax-based sharing. And basically, 40% of the taxes from a development go into this big pool, and then that's redistributed. And so what this is doing is it's cutting down the incentive to just develop at all costs. Well, that's what the theory is. Okay. Chris, yep.
I'm strangely enough, because of my age, thinking about elders in the community. And it seems to me a place like Binghamton is perfectly situated to respond to those needs. If it doesn't do that, we're all going to move south, to get away from the winter. But we have an aging population, and as rational individuals, we ought to be interested in living in a place where driving is no longer necessary, where services are fairly close, and where we are in community.
Mhm.
I live in the suburbs. It's been perfect raising kids, but I would like to be able to move to someplace where I could be with people my own age, in a diverse community, where being outside in the winter is not entirely necessary. The thing that saddens me is that most living choices now are actually in the suburbs. That the
Yes.
places I can move to are not urban, at least around here. And I would love to see us as a community think about how to create, and if you walk through downtown Binghamton, there's a whole lot of high-rise, relatively uninhabited space that could be transformed, that could make a place for all of us to be closer together, and to spend time together as we age, and incidentally reduce our environmental footprint substantially.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. And I think it's we did a project for the Office for Aging that tried to look at, I mean, they've been dabbling in this idea of these kinds of villages where people can be more walkable. We had something in our college, at the College of Community and Public Affairs at Binghamton University, where the dean and some other people were trying to develop a co-living community where young and old would be together. And I was trying to tell them that it has to be in an urban place, because that, just as you said, Chris, we can walk, we can, it's a nicer place to age as we have to stop driving. But it's really hard to get past this mentality of danger, of contamination. And this is something we have to continually, keep working on.
Yeah.
But I think that's I think that the reasons these places sprawl out is for the same reasons anything does. They're enticed with tax breaks. They get cheap land. Their workers have quick access to, they can put big parking lots in. I mean, we caused this. I mean,
well, that I was going to say, we did it to ourselves.
yes, we in our
We
policy
chose to move to the suburbs.
Yes. And I'm going to talk now about some policies we could change that would help. But, we have to be thinking about the developers are reacting rationally. The people who move to the suburbs are acting rationally. We can't say you are bad, move to the city. We have to start saying, we have to think about how we can change the system so that
what's going to attract people to the city.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of my big pushes with students on all areas of the environment is we always say, oh, you should recycle more, but we don't make it easy to recycle. You should not drive less, but we don't make it easy to drive less. We have to change the system, and this is no different. So all this stuff, which I just talked about, is very hard to do over time. What can we do? Yeah, it fails, and it would be interesting, Andy, to understand why. Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of it has to do with people not willing to give up power or not willing to give up identity and things like that. But it's because it's very sad. And sometimes it also doesn't make sense. I mean, if we make our school districts too big, we don't want to be busing kids, for 45 minutes in the morning. Or maybe we do. I don't know what it is, but like an hour or however whatever the limit is. But there are places where we certainly can be doing a better job. So one thing I want to urge people to think about is to recognize this. We're always fighting for this tax base, okay? Because we're trying to pay for these kinds of things. And I don't know if you've heard of the American Farmland Trust. I'm sure someone else thought of it before them, but they've done these cost of services studies. And this is looking at how much development really brings in terms of tax dollars. And this is even before you give people tax breaks. This is just pure, without tax breaks. So this is one that I did in the town of Victor, because they're like, one of the refrains is, we need this residential development because we need the tax breaks. But if you look at how much residential development costs, and this was their budget broken down by the different land uses, residential development costs a lot. Why? Well, a lot of it is schools. We send kids to schools. A lot of it is, the fire and police and the water services and things like that. And in the other areas, we have fewer school children, obviously coming out of factories, fewer out of farms because it's less dense. So, we can start to tell people and do a pretty simple analysis, how much all the residential homes cost in the town of Victor to the community, how much they bring in terms of taxes. And then you do a simple ratio and you can say, look, for every dollar brought in taxes, you think it's broadening our tax base, but it really costs $1.76 in services, whereas commercial and industrial and agriculture is better. And you see this over and over again. This is from the American Farmland Trust report. This is the New York and New Jersey sections. And you can see that the cost of services and the tax development is not as good as people would expect. Now, this is why people push for commercial development. We can't not have homes because we need to have homes, but we need to have a balance, and we need to be able to push back on arguments that says this is important for our tax base. It is important to have people and customers, but it's sometimes a something that's, it's illusionary. We can talk about remaking the roads. We talked last time about complete streets and about making them more walkable. And I showed these slides last time of my walk from where the Enterprise used to be back to campus one Sunday morning. And, how unwalkable this real main road in Vestal is. Well, maybe this could be a bit more of a boulevard, and think about how we can add greenery to it. Think about how we can make it safer for people to cross, to walk on, to bike on, and things like that. And this is a way to bring, this would actually raise the attractiveness of Vestal, so it might contribute to more people wanting to be there, and would certainly raise property values, but it would help with some of the economic, the environmental and issues that are going on, and walkability and things like that. So we need to rethink these kinds of things and to make it better. And that can happen. That has to happen when things are changed, but that can be put into plans. So over 5 or 10 years, things will change. The same with reducing parking lot size. This is from just outside of Saratoga Springs. We have big parking lots. We have the same thing here in Vestal. But what we have on our code books, and this is from the code in Vestal, is we have these requirements for parking, these minimum requirements that make no sense. So this is an example. It's like 3 pages long. It's just item after item after item. And they make no sense for the amount of utilization. And so this is how big different restaurants are. I'm going to go through how much space this is. And look at this top one, a restaurant, 20 spaces plus 100 square feet, 1 per 100 square feet of floor area. We'll just stick with that for now. You don't need to worry about the drive-through and stuff like that. So if we take a simple McDonald's that's 4,000 square feet, that means we need 20 spaces plus another 40 spaces because the average McDonald's is 4,000 square feet. So you need 60 spaces, okay? Each space is 320 square feet on average. They can be 9 by 20, plus you need turnaround and travel space. So you've got a 19,000 foot parking lot. So for a simple McDonald's, you have to have 4.8 times as much land area as building area for parking. And we see how that causes sprawl. We see this is our McDonald's in Vestal, and we can see how much parking there is around it, and how underutilized it is. And you can see how underutilized it is at Kohl's and underutilized it is at Target. And this is a common suburban problem. I'll skip that issue for the moment. And so one of the things that we recommend, I mean, this is the traditional approach. And what it requires is that there's a minimum number greater than the possible number of people who will be there, because we're worried that there won't be enough cars and we'll lose customers, or we're worried there won't be enough parking spaces and and they'll park on the street or something like that. So there's no maximum, there's just this minimum. And what we're arguing for more is where you don't have a minimum, but you have some sort of maximum, so that you could say, yeah, you need parking, but let's think about it and let's figure out, this is the most we want you to have because of the design in our kind of area. And you can decide whether you want to get there or whether you want to build less. Go ahead, Valdi, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just sitting here shaking my head. It's insanity. I have lived here since 1985, and even at the height of retail back in the 80s, when the Oakdale Mall was running full tilt, all the places were rented out full. It was, no spaces empty. That parking lot was almost never full, even at the height of Christmas shopping season. And the same thing goes true for the Town Square Mall and for whatever the mall is called where the Target is right now. They plow that entire parking lot when it snows too, even though most of the parking lot now is just a ghost town. I mean, you could play baseball out there. You've got maybe 24 cars at most at Kohl's at any one time, and you've got probably a couple of hundred parking spots. Like, it's insanity.
Yep. No, and communities are recognizing this all around the country, and they're changing from parking minimums to parking maximums, and they're requiring shared parking, which is an important innovation. It's not that innovative, but when Kohl's is full, maybe the office place next to it is not, and can there be ways of sharing parking and making connections and thinking more, cities anyway, thinking more about parking districts. So yeah, we rethinking parking. And the other thing to think about from an economic perspective is that's wasted land. I mean, that's land that's generating no tax dollars and no profit for the owner of it. And so we need to be rethinking how we do this. And in places where we don't have tons of demand, like in upstate New York, where we're not growing like crazy, often we can turn it into, or turn parts of it into, something that will benefit the environment, that will slow stormwater runoff. I mean, we can find other ways of using this land, either to make more money or to protect the environment. But yeah, parking lots tend to be a huge problem. I don't want to keep people too long. I'm trying to see, we can, yeah, we're not going to be able to get through everything. We can refocus development in our already developed areas. So you think we have Town Square Mall. Can we build upon that? So this is a famous drawing of a new urbanist type project, taking this mall and chopping it up, and basically saying, well, we've got this mall here, we've got all this parking, what can we do with it? We can put housing in, we can break up the mall, as you'll see in these drawings, and we can start to use this and make it more walkable and have less parking lots and put more green space in and make it more profitable, and protect the environmental values. This is what actually has happened to it. They've started to add outbuildings to it. But it only gets so far because there's only so much that localities are willing to do and that developers are willing to do. Here's a better example. This is in Mashpee, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. They had no town center. They had this big sprawling parking lot around a supermarket. And what these developers came in and they had to lobby the town to do what I'm about to describe to you, because the town liked this, because that's all they knew. They wanted big parking lots. They wanted auto-centric. They didn't want to risk losing business. And what they did was they filled it in. and they built buildings in the parking lot, and they turned it into a walkable town center. So that now you still have to drive to get there. It's not perfect. And a lot of these second stories are fake. They're meant to look like a town, but there's nothing happening up here. It's either a tall inside the store, or it's storage or an office for the store. There isn't really, it's kind of wasted. It's pretend space, but they create a place that looks really good. And here you can see how it's changed over time. And then in their drawing, they had hoped for eventually over here, and I have not checked to see whether it's happened, they want to have more housing put in. So it can be someplace where you don't have to drive to, but you can actually live there and walk to shopping. You probably have to drive to work because it's not a city. But, it's starting to remake a suburb into something that is a little bit more environmentally friendly, and it's more profitable. These developers told me, I did a story on them when I was back in my journalist days. They told me that, a lot of the stores wouldn't believe them and would say, no, we can't go into a place like this. And they said, hey, we so believe this that we won't charge you rent. We'll just take a percentage of your profits. And so they went in and did that. And of course, the developers made more money. The stores, these retail stores, these chains made more money than they thought they would. And the developers made more money than they would in rent, because they believed in this and because it is attractive to have people walk around, even in Massachusetts where there's snow, even in, I think, New York State, we can do these kinds of things. So making these places more walkable is important. Here's another quick example. We'll just blow through this. Oh yeah, we've got no time left. This is Lee Outlets. Again, it's a fake town, but it's very comfortable to walk around in. And then there have been studies to show, and that's what this is, that increasing walkability in a place actually makes it more profitable. And then I will talk about for residential conservation subdivisions. I don't know if anyone has heard about this, but this is a typical subdivision plot. What you can see here, they basically cut up the land, stick the road in, and everyone gets, more or less equal spaces. And, they've just ruined all conservation value. There are people thinking creatively about, well, let's make it a little more dense, and then let's protect large swaths of the land. Now, of course, that only works if this is part of a larger plan. So there's a swath of land here that's protected, and a swath of land here that's protected, and not just this one-off place. So there are creative ways to remake the suburbs. I'm going to wrap it up now because I know it's 8:30 and I want to be respectful of people's times. The other thing that this doesn't show, and that I would urge in terms of these developments, is making connections. So, this is a dead end, so nothing can happen in some places. And what we talk about now is in suburban areas, set up the developments so you can eventually connect it to the next one. If you're going to build here, let's build in a way that makes it easier to walk. Let's build in a way that makes it easier to access. So this person only has one way in versus, we can go around and things like that. And there's lots of studies about how these are much better. And in Seaside, Florida, which if you've seen the movie Truman Show, what it was based on, they did this. They connected it to an adjacent neighborhood, and they built places for other connections to, expecting there to be more development around them. All right. I think that will do it. I mean, the big message I want to leave with is that we need to think about how we can change relationships, get past this, this fight for the development dollar, recognize that development has costs as well as benefits, and then think about in these last 3, 4, and 5, how we can remake the sprawl, remake the suburbs, retrofit them so that if they still have sprawling problems, we can at least make them more environmentally friendly, cut down car use, increase walking, and have more green space. All right, it is 8:31. I apologize for going on and on. There's like a million different aspects of this, and I'd be happy to chat. I could stick around now if people want to talk about it or want to raise anything else. And I'd be happy to, you know, particular issues in Vestal we can talk about or have students research or whatever. And this
Yeah,
is my,
George,
yes.
so in this area, we have a decayed urban center, not just Binghamton, but the other municipalities as well. And I mean, we all would like to see more use of that and less building out in the outer areas. So do you see that as the big problem maybe in this area, or am I off base?
I mean, it's a mix. I think that it's because we don't have growth, it's a little less of a problem than it is, say, in Victor, New York, where they're growing like crazy. So our region doesn't have growth. I do think it's a problem, but what we should be doing is protecting the downtown so that people don't want to leave it. And sprawl, and then because pretty much anyone who comes, it's at the cost of downtown. I mean, yes, people move in, but as you saw from those numbers, there's as the downtown continues to go down, the region stays flat. So really, those people are coming from, in essence, coming from Binghamton or Johnson City, Endicott, the village of Endicott, things like that. And we should be trying to secure these places. One thing that I think is kind of controversial that I'll say is that I don't think we can protect all these places. And, Village of Endicott wants to boom. The Village of Johnson City wants to boom. Binghamton wants to boom. I don't know if all of them can boom. And I think we need a rational plan where those places are supported and boom as much as they can boom. Perhaps as an outlier to Binghamton. Now, of course, I'm biased because I used to live in Binghamton and we'll move back to Binghamton. But we have to think rationally. We're not going to get the growth that's going to raise all three of these urban areas. We have to think, well, what is the role of Johnson City? What is the role of Endicott in these places? Could they be smaller outlying villages? And let's take down all the parking lots in some of the places, and that is costing them a lot. I don't know. I've rambled about that, but I hope that answers your question.
I hope we continue to think about our aging population. And one of the things that strikes me, I mean, I live out in the suburbs, but I walk around the city of Binghamton routinely. And if you think about the size of houses and actually the beauty, the phenomenal investment in housing in those areas, and the number of people who are living one or two to a house, I would love to see us find ways to intensify the use of residential housing, especially in urban areas. It would benefit poorer people who have an awful lot of house and not a lot of income. And it would create opportunities for new audiences to move into the urban area. Intensifying the use of that housing would be very helpful for all of us. And I don't know how easy it is to do. I'm sure it's not, but it's very
it's always just money, Chris. I mean, that's the thing is, if the state said this is important, let's do this, we could do this. I do think we need to have a lot more market rate development in the city of Binghamton in order to boost our tax base. Because that will pay for some of the other housing, not necessarily just for seniors, but lower income housing as well. But a lot of this has to come from, priorities that the state and the region will have. And right now they're all scattered because, the governor doesn't get reelected by saying, we're going to let you shrink Johnson City, or we're going to, stop letting you grow Vestal. I mean, it's a big political challenge, I think.
But I also wonder about how we tax things. So if somebody says, well, I've got 6 bedrooms in my house, I'd like to rent out a couple of them. or I would like to develop an apartment with a separate entrance. You know, what would be the tax implications of that? How can we encourage people to do that rather than effectively discouraging it?
Yep. And there are ways to do that. I mean, we do have creative tax schemes to help people. We just have to be willing to put them in and apply them to individuals and people who tend to not be those people who can lobby for and get the big tax breaks.
Yeah.
Valdi?
Yes, thank you, George, and thank you, Chris, for your comments. I think those are good ideas. One thing that I want to bring up that just is close to me because I live in the outskirts of Endicott, just north of Endicott, and Endicott is benefiting from basically the greening of our state's economy. There are a lot of residents in the area that still poo-poo that and are against that for political reasons. But actually, economically, we are growing as a result of that. And the New Energy New York project that is spearheaded by Binghamton University, that is going to do even more for our greater region even. So this creates an opportunity. If we can get our various elected officials at multiple villages, towns, and the county, and even the adjacent county in Tioga, especially, and possibly even as far away as the Ithaca area, to work together and cooperate and think ahead, not just compete against each other in sort of a random chaotic fashion, but think, hey, if we're going to have more lithium-ion battery manufacturing, which already started in downtown Endicott, and they're going to be building a gigafactory probably within the next year, because they're going to demolish some old IBM buildings that have been abandoned for decades. This is huge growth in employment and in the tax base, which is already spurring development. And this is going to eventually increase the school districts up, school age population as well. So these are all things that people should be thinking about. And I think a coordination rather than just competition among these various levels of government in the area would be hugely beneficial, because there's going to be a lot of supporting businesses that are going to spring up as well that will feed these big industries that are starting to be built in this area. And one thing we need to think about very quickly is this plan by the Broome County Industrial Development Agency to buy hundreds of acres, which would add to our suburban sprawl. They want to buy acreage northeast of Oakdale Mall. Basically, it's a huge hill that is overgrown old farmland and some woods, very steep approaches, small road on the south side and airport road on the east side, which has problematic approaches to it. And meanwhile, we've got a lot of brownfield space, much of it abandoned, some of it contaminated, some not, that is underutilized in the flatlands that has better access to transportation and utilities. And I hope that the county government can influence this decision to stop this. They haven't started buying any land yet, but they have issued letters of intent. So this is one example of where we have a critical moment right before us here. So our group already is involved in looking into this, and there are community members that are also speaking out about it. So I'm wondering what your comments are about this.
I mean, I think in terms of a regional, all of that development, we should be focused in places that are already developed. So, just as you said, when we talk about brownfields, yeah, they might be contaminated, but they might not. And even if they are contaminated, they're not going to be playgrounds. They don't need to be cleaned up at this point to a high level but they will have to, something will have to be done with them. But it could be very simple, but people get scared of that, especially when there's any kind of costs. So, I think the coordination is possible, or is important, that that we focus development in areas of already, I mean, we just have we could put a lot of these things in some of these old parking lots or in, a lot of the brownfields in downtown Binghamton and a lot in Endicott too, of brownfields there too. We could be using that. And then what we could be doing is saying to Johnson City, hey, you used to have all this stuff. Why don't we pay you some money? And, these buildings in the floodplain, like I showed, I went through it very quickly, where the Home Depot flooded and things like that. Let's take those down. Let's make this more floodplain. But, we're not going to let you lose that dollars. We're going to share that with you because that's why people would want that kind of thing. And that's where the county should be coordinating these efforts between local governments, is saying, we'll want the development here. We know it's going to be very valuable. And we want, and we'll help you. If you don't get the development, Binghamton or Johnson City, we'll help you do something good with it. Fix up your downtown, protect your floodplains, get homes and businesses out of floodplains. But that takes coordination that we don't do very well in New York State. I mean, we literally don't. Some places with metropolitan councils, Chattanooga area does this, better. Portland does this better, but we tend to not have this kind of coordination. I think the county should be doing this. You hit the nail right on the head. This is something the county could be doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think we have great opportunity here, and people should have a little more faith that this area can regrow and become economically vital and become a nicer place to live at the same time if we do this the right way and think about it a little bit and have some foresight. People that are giving up on this area, I think they're a little short-sighted. So thank you for your comments, and I think there is plenty of room to do this the right way. And if we are creative in how we finance this, I think it can work out. And thank you.
And I wouldn't say we don't have to grow. We can grow a little bit, and certainly there are opportunities to grow. But if we work together, we can focus our efforts to make ourselves a more attractive community, broadly. But this idea that we need to get up to 80,000 people to be successful, we have to put that out of our heads. The one thing I should have said, and this is a sad thing to end on, but I do think climate change is going to be pushing more and more people to upstate New York. I don't know what will happen I think we have the water, we have the space. It may change. We don't completely know how our water supply will go. But I think we need to start thinking now about how we become a climate destination place. And not just a sprawling place. So if we doubled our population, is it just going to sprawl outward, or can we focus it? I wouldn't do that. I talked to you about that. I don't think, like Victor mentioned, the comprehensive plan. I'm not sure I would mention that as part of the Vestal comprehensive plan because that's decades away. But you need to start putting ideas in place that will help, fill in the areas, the developed areas of Vestal, and then of course the urban cores with people and with businesses that will go with these people over the long term.
And George, I would just say, we really need to think about this as a retirement community. Because I don't know how much time you've spent in Florida lately, but it is not a very attractive place to retire unless you like being inside.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that's a perfect opportunity because we are already aging, but we just have to get these developers who create these communities to, my friend's mother lives in a retirement community that's a high rise in San Francisco. Of course, it's in San Francisco, so they can't sprawl anywhere. But we can do that.
Well, we can also redo the housing we have to make it more accessible, to utilize. I mean, my God, as I said before, we live in a house with 4 bedrooms and there are 2 of us. It made sense when we had kids at home. It doesn't make any sense now, but we can't afford to leave. And the question is, how do we, throughout this area, how do we, through tax changes and things like that encourage people to redevelop their homes to make them more livable for more people. It would benefit all of us, especially those of us who are basically lonely in large houses.
Yeah, and I like your idea too, that of trying to make retirees be able to move into an urban area, because especially if it's together with, you know, more student housing too, because now you have a more chance of intermingling, and there's more vibrant nightlife, there's more restaurants, things to do, and it's all within walkable distance, and you have access to where the normal place where public transportation is. So all of this makes eminent sense. And I wish people would latch onto this idea and encourage it more. But, you know, we seem to be putting in more luxury housing than we are, you know, more practical housing for seniors. Nobody seems to be thinking about it. And
If your sole goal is profit maximization, that's what you're going to get. High-end housing. So that's the role of government, to create opportunities to do things for real people that benefit the majority, not the rich.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's true with a lot of things. The profit motive drives a lot of illogical outcomes, and you know, climate change is one of them. It's just, this is such a common thread among government, that the courage to do what's reasonable and what is proper and morally makes sense is often too missing and gets left behind, and people just see the dollar signs from developers. And the one thing that sparked my mind too is you mentioned the I think the American Farmers Trust, and we've been talking about sprawl, and farmers retire and they sell their land and it becomes, you know, host to this sprawl. And one of the things that New York State government just did is enact legislation to supposedly protect farmland that people mistakenly think is being overrun by solar farms. This is one of my pet peeves. This is an imaginary thing that might happen here and there, but the big picture is permanent loss of farmland is driven by sprawl, cutting up of farms into suburbs, and you know, these strip malls and office parks and industrial parks, and you know, more roads. That's permanent. Nobody takes and demolishes these things once they're built and creates farmland again. Whereas a solar farm, you can take the solar panels away, dig up the footers, and then you can make it plowable again for a farm. And you can do simultaneous agriculture at the same time, raising certain crops that like some shade, some cooler conditions. You can have grazing animals, sheep in particular, underneath the solar panels. So this is one of my pet peeves. Sorry to go on a tangent, but this fits in, dovetails very well with what you've been talking about.
Yeah, everybody, we should let George wrap it up, because he's got to travel tomorrow and go to work. So
Thanks, George.
Oh,
yeah.
my pleasure.
Thanks,
I really
Scott.
enjoyed talking to you all, and I'm happy to keep the conversation going if anyone wants. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much, George. There's just a couple more things in the chat. I won't close it down yet. Oh, they're just thank yous to you, George.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, my pleasure. And yeah, solar farms and wind farms do allow farmers to keep things go. You know, it's interesting, but we do get all twisted. And I think a lot of it is we don't think systematically. And that's what we need to be starting to do. So I can leave it there.